It was February 20th, 1944, the start of Big Week, the massive Allied air offensive intended to cripple the German aircraft industry once and for all. Hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses from England roared into the gray morning skies, engines pounding in unison, vapor trails slicing through the cold air. Among them, 3 aircraft from the 303rd Bomb Group, known as Hell's Angels, lifted off from Molesworth Airfield, destined for Leipzig, Germany. They would never return. At first, it was an ordinary mission. The 303rd, flying in tight formation, had been briefed to target the Messerschmitt assembly plants east of Leipzig. Pilots knew the route was deadly. Heavy flak zones, Luftwaffe interception corridors, and unpredictable weather patterns made every sortie a test of endurance. But the crews were veterans. They had flown over Schweinfurt, Bremen, and Hamburg, each one a nightmare in its own right. They knew what was waiting. Captain Harold Red Hewitt, piloting B-17 Lucky Lady, led the trio of fortresses, his wingmen being Eagle's Cry, commanded by Lieutenant James Cooper, and Liberty Bell, under Lieutenant John Mackay. They were experienced, disciplined, and well-coordinated. At 9:20 hours, just after crossing the Dutch coastline, radio chatter filled the intercoms, tight, professional, and calm. But beyond the routine reports, something was different that morning. The Germans seemed to anticipate their every move. By the time they reached the Rhine, enemy flak was waiting precisely along their expected corridor. Shells exploded in the sky like black blossoms. The formation scattered slightly, never a good sign, but regrouped as they pushed east. The bomber stream was so thick it stretched for miles, yet amidst the chaos, those 3 fortresses stood out. They were flying slightly lower than the rest, almost as if following another vector. Then came the confusion. As the formation neared Leipzig around 11:15 hours, heavy cloud cover rolled in. Pilots switched to instruments, radios buzzed with overlapping transmissions, and a strange order crackled through the headsets. 303rd, adjust heading to 147 degrees. Confirm, 147. Lieutenant Cooper would later note in his personal diary, "We heard a second voice on command frequency. It wasn't ours." Moments later, ground radar at Molesworth recorded something inexplicable. 3 B-17s from the 303rd peeled away from the main group, turning southeast, straight into the clouds. No further communication was received. At 11:27 hours, the blips faded completely from radar screens. The rest of the formation pressed on, losing dozens of aircraft to flak and fighters, but completing their bombing run. No one noticed the trio's absence until they failed to check in during the return flight. By late afternoon, it became clear something had gone terribly wrong. Search and rescue aircraft were launched, scouring likely crash zones across central Germany, but found nothing. No smoke plumes, no distress calls, no parachutes. German intercepts reported no claims matching those serial numbers. It was as if the planes had flown into another sky. Back at Molesworth, debriefings grew tense. Major Robert Tate, the operations officer, reviewed the mission logs again and again. The last confirmed position was near Naumburg, roughly 60 miles off course. The weather had been bad, yes, but entire aircraft simply disappearing without a trace was unheard of. One navigator recalled a moment of strange interference on the radio band just before losing sight of Lucky Lady. The static, he said, sounded like voices layered over each other. Our own commands played back with an echo. For the families back home, telegrams arrived with the usual sterile phrasing, "Missing in action, Germany." No explanation. No closure. Many of the crewmen's effects were boxed and sent home weeks later. Inside one, a folded mission map was found with a penciled note on the margin. "If we don't make it back, tell them we followed orders." In the weeks that followed, the losses were quietly added to the unit's tally. The war moved on, missions continued. But among the men of the 303rd, the story lingered. Over mess hall coffee and late-night cigarettes, they whispered about that phantom radio call, the order that led 3 bombers into oblivion. Some said it was German signal interference, a clever deception to lure them off course. Others believed it was an Allied frequency error, a tragic case of crossed wires. But a few, including Major Tate, weren't convinced. The official report concluded loss due to operational circumstances, a vague phrase that meant nothing and everything at once. Years later, when historians reviewed the mission archive, they found no record of any authorized heading change to 147 degrees that day. The message, whatever it was, came from nowhere, or from someone who didn't exist. As the final bombs fell on Leipzig that day, smoke covered the city, and the skies filled with the ghosts of burned aircraft. But somewhere beyond that horizon, 3 B-17s were still missing. Their fuel endurance should have brought them down within 2 hours. Yet not a single trace. No wreckage, no crash reports, no German capture documents ever surfaced. And so began one of the 8th Air Force's most enduring mysteries. 3 aircraft, 30 men, gone without a trace over enemy skies. The official records called it anomalous loss during combat operations. But among the men who flew with them, one phrase endured for decades: the sky swallowed them whole. Next time, we follow the desperate investigation that tried to uncover what really happened when scattered wreckage began to surface hundreds of miles from where the planes were last seen. The morning after the disappearance, tension gripped RAF Molesworth. The 303rd Bomb Group's intelligence officers were already combing through mission data, trying to reconstruct the final hours of the missing fortresses. Colonel Curtis LeMay's headquarters demanded answers. How could 3 B-17s, veteran crews with flawless records, simply vanish in daylight over a known route? Military investigators began by tracing radio logs, flight paths, and last confirmed sightings. The results were baffling. Ground radar at RAF Alconbury had logged the formation correctly until 11:15 hours when Lucky Lady, Eagle's Cry, and Liberty Bell abruptly veered southeast. They didn't crash in the target zone or along the return corridor. Instead, their transponder echoes dissolved over the German state of Saxony, in a region known for dense forests and scattered villages. In the days that followed, Allied intelligence dispatched photo reconnaissance Spitfires over potential crash sites. Nothing. No smoldering debris, no impact scars in fields, no reports from the German press, something the Luftwaffe usually exploited for propaganda. Yet within a week, local German police and Wehrmacht units began filing confusing, contradictory reports. One report from the village of Zeitz mentioned a heavy aircraft exploding in midair, while another from Altenburg claimed to have found wreckage of American origin, but no bodies. A third, filed near Gera, described parachutes drifting into the woods, but when German patrols arrived, they found no airmen, living or dead. Each account was separated by dozens of miles, suggesting the bombers broke formation or were scattered by an unknown cause. Lieutenant James Cooper's diary, recovered from his footlocker at Molesworth, added a chilling clue. On the morning of the flight, Cooper wrote, "Strange interference in the comms during briefing." Lieutenant Hewitt seemed uneasy. Some new code phrase mentioned, "Not in our orders, Vector Z." No one knew what it meant. The entry stopped abruptly, followed by one final line written that same evening, likely before takeoff. "If signal repeats, we change heading. Must trust command." That signal would become the center of the investigation. Signals officers later confirmed that during the mission window, a secondary transmission had been detected on the 303 RD's command frequency. It mimicked Allied radio structure but originated from an unverified source. British intelligence suggested it could have been a German Mayakan, a radio beacon designed to jam or redirect Allied aircraft by rebroadcasting false navigational signals. The Mayakan theory seemed plausible. The Luftwaffe had begun deploying such systems in late 1943, tricking bomber crews into altering their bearings toward heavily defended zones. But something didn't fit. The 3 missing B-17s weren't lured toward flat concentrations. They disappeared into regions with minimal anti-air defenses, areas irrelevant to strategic bombing. Meanwhile, fragments of wreckage started surfacing across Saxony. A farmer near Borna discovered an oxygen tank marked U.S. Army Air Forces, while another report described a damaged tail fin matching Eagle's Cry's serial number. Yet neither location matched known impact sites. Investigators concluded that the debris had likely fallen during midair breakup, but again, no major wreck was ever located. A surviving crewman from a neighboring squadron later recalled seeing the formation through cloud gaps just before contact was lost. His testimony was brief but haunting. They weren't under attack. No smoke, no flames. They were there 1 minute, gone the next. Like the clouds ate them. As the investigation deepened, officials grew increasingly cautious. Public statements were minimal. Internal memos labeled the case classified, sensitive communications compromise. Analysts from Bletchley Park were consulted to determine whether the enemy had intercepted mission frequencies or mimicked them. The result was inconclusive. However, one decoded German message, intercepted 2 days after the mission, read, "American formation diverted successfully. Target Z, misidentified, record incomplete. To this day, historians debate the meaning of Target Z. It does not appear in any Allied or German operational charts. Some speculate it referred to a Luftwaffe experimental base, possibly connected to radio countermeasures testing in early 1944. Others believe it may have been a deliberate disinformation phrase inserted by the Germans to confuse Allied analysts. Major Robert Tate, who led the inquiry at Molesworth, wrote privately in his notes, "Either we lost them to weather and interference, or someone on our side issued a false order. I can't prove which is worse." The psychological toll on the unit was immense. Surviving crewmen grew wary of radio transmissions, some refusing to acknowledge mid-flight frequency changes unless confirmed visually. The loss of 30 seasoned airmen haunted the 303rd through the remainder of the war, their names etched quietly on the group's roll of honor, but never spoken about in official debriefs. As weeks turned into months, the mystery was quietly shelved under combat loss, non-recoverable. Yet rumors persisted among the ground crews, whispers of experimental navigational signals, new jamming equipment, and unacknowledged missions tagged under Operation Raven. None of it was ever officially linked, but those who'd seen the paperwork swore the timing aligned exactly. The disappearance of the three fortresses might have been chalked up to fog, enemy interference, or pure misfortune. But to the men who flew with them, the question remained. If it was only a technical failure, why classify the findings? As one mechanic put it years later, standing by the memorial wall at Molesworth, "We lost hundreds of planes over Germany. We always found something: burnt metal, torn fabric, dog tags. But those three are nothing. Like someone erased them from the sky." The investigation's official conclusion, signed in March 1944, closed the file with chilling simplicity: operational ambiguity due to radio interference. No further action recommended. But behind that language lay fear. Fear that the missing fortresses hadn't been victims of chance, but participants in something never meant to be found. Next, we'll explore how wartime secrecy buried the truth, as classified orders and debriefs began pointing to an unacknowledged Allied project known only as Target Z. By the spring of 1944, the disappearance of the three B-17s had become a quiet embarrassment within the 8th Air Force. Officially, the incident had been written off as radio interference and weather complications. Unofficially, the silence around it grew suspicious. Pilots who asked too many questions found themselves reassigned. Crews were told not to mention the losses to the press, or even to other squadrons. In the operations hut at RAF Molesworth, Major Robert Tate pored over the restricted files one more time. He'd flown reconnaissance himself and knew when reports didn't add up. The mission maps, carefully drawn in grease pencil on clear overlays, showed a sudden course deviation that no navigator would have made willingly. It wasn't toward the enemy, it was into the unknown. Then, something unexpected surfaced. In late March, an intelligence officer forwarded Tate a declassified carbon copy of a flight routing document marked Supplemental Objective, Target Z. The order carried no origin signature, but its typewriter ID matched paperwork from the 8 Bomber Command's Operations Division. The coordinates referenced a patch of forest east of Karl-Marx-Stadt, then Chemnitz, a location that didn't correspond to any known industrial or military target. Tate took the finding to Colonel LeMay's staff at High Wycombe. The meeting was brief and uncomfortable. When he presented the Target Z document, the colonel's adjutant froze, then quietly removed it from the folder. LeMay's response was terse: "Drop this line of inquiry, Major. Those men were heroes. Leave it at that." For a combat officer like Tate, that phrase meant one thing: something classified was being protected. Meanwhile, fragments of testimony from ground crews began surfacing. A radio technician recalled being ordered to recalibrate transmitters on the missing aircraft the night before the mission, specifically to test frequency drift correction equipment. Another crew chief remembered unusual wiring in Lucky Lady's radio bay, with an extra antenna connection he'd never seen before. When he asked what it was for, he was told simply, "Top secret, experimental." Historians now believe these modifications may have been part of Operation Raven, a covert electronic warfare program aimed at disrupting German radar and communications. Raven, begun in late 1943, tested advanced signal reflection and false beacon transmitters aboard select bomber crews. The idea was to blind German radar long enough for main formations to pass. But such technology carried enormous risk, especially if interference corrupted the bomber's own navigation systems. The question then became, were the missing B-17s Raven test platforms? If so, They were flying into danger not by enemy deception, but under orders from their own command. The operation would have required radio silence and secret directives, perhaps even a unique frequency signal, the very 147-degree order Lieutenant Cooper noted before vanishing. One surviving technician from the 482nd Bomb Group, interviewed decades later, added another puzzle piece. There were rumors the 303rd had borrowed a set of our blind navigation beacons. They were supposed to return them after Leipzig, but the logbooks just end. One of our officers said the devices weren't safe. They could pick up false reflections from the ground and feed back into the system. False reflections, ghost signals, could explain why the three fortresses changed course so suddenly, following what appeared to be a valid command. Still, nothing concrete surfaced. The U.S. Army Air Forces archives contain no mission labeled Target Z, no after-action reports, no acknowledgement of Operation Raven test flights on that date. In 1945, as the war neared its end, countless experimental documents were destroyed or reclassified under the sweeping secrecy of Project Paperclip. Tate retired after the war, never receiving closure. In a 1961 interview, he said, "Those boys weren't shot down. They were written off." There's a difference. For decades, the case lay dormant until declassification acts in the 1980s released fragments of old mission summaries. Among them was one remarkable entry from a signals analysis log dated February 20th, 1944, unidentified friendly beacon active. Frequency 36.45 MHz. Source unknown. Duration 6 minutes. That short burst matched the window of time between the last confirmed radar fix and the bomber's disappearance. To some historians, it was proof that the lost fortresses had been testing an early form of electronic countermeasure, and that it failed catastrophically. To others, it was evidence of something more calculated, an unrecorded diversion mission deliberately erased from history. What remains undeniable is that 3 aircraft were lost, 30 men disappeared, and their final transmissions were censored from the official combat logs. The radio tapes from that day, once stored at Bletchley Park, were later reported misplaced. The deeper researchers dug, the clearer it became that the story of the lost B-17s was not a simple wartime accident. It was buried under layers of operational secrecy. By the time the Cold War began, the phrase Target Z had resurfaced in a handful of RAF intelligence memos related to early electronic warfare. Each reference was crossed out, replaced with classified material removed. Whatever Target Z truly was, an experiment, a diversion, or something even more strategic, its trace leads to one conclusion: those aircraft may not have been lost by chance, but by design. Next, we turn to the post-war years, when German radar logs and eyewitness accounts reopen the mystery, revealing that the missing fortresses may have flown far beyond their intended route before vanishing for good. After the war ended in 1945, the European theater was littered with records, some destroyed, some buried in secret vaults, and some simply overlooked. It wasn't until the 1980s that historians began combing through declassified Luftwaffe radar logs from central Germany that the missing B-17s appeared again, not as wreckage, but as fleeting blips that defied explanation. These were sightings recorded over Saxony and the Thuringian Forest, hundreds of miles from any planned route. According to former Luftwaffe operators who spoke with researchers decades later, the radar blips indicated 3 large aircraft traveling in tight formation, then suddenly disappearing mid-flight. One operator, Oberfeldwebel Hans Richter, recalled, "We watched them for a few minutes. They were perfectly aligned, heading southeast. Then a nothing. The signals just stopped. There was no crash, no return. Gone." Local civilian accounts provided additional, unsettling fragments. Farmers and foresters reported seeing B-17 silhouettes descending toward isolated valleys near Altenburg and Gera, followed by parachutes that drifted silently to the ground. Patrols sent to investigate found only forest floor and broken branches. No airmen were found. It was as though the aircraft had vanished while still airborne. Meanwhile, Allied records remained frustratingly vague. RAF and U.S. intelligence had little to add. The reports were classified under top-secret operational test. When analysts cross-referenced German radar sightings with mission timelines, they noticed something striking. The times aligned almost perfectly with the flight of the 3 missing fortresses. But the locations did not. A technical report buried in the archives hinted at an explanation. Engineers noted that experimental radio beacons, part of what may have been Operation Raven, had an unusual tendency to generate phantom reflections, causing instruments to miscalculate distance and direction. The document, never intended for public release, warned, under specific conditions, false beacon signals can result in aircraft diverging from assigned vectors without pilot awareness. If true, it would explain why the three B-17s were recorded far off their expected path, scattered across Saxony. The implication was chilling. The very technology intended to protect the bombers could have guided them into oblivion. Yet the story became more perplexing. Some radar blips suggested the aircraft may have maintained near-level flight for over an hour after vanishing from Allied radar. If the crews were unaware of the deviation, they were essentially flying blind in enemy territory, unprotected and invisible to their own command. Historians who visited former crash sites decades later found only isolated debris, a twisted wing section near Zeitz, oxygen tanks scattered across forested slopes, and a fragment of a tail rudder marked 303rd Bird. Each piece confirmed the B-17s had flown intact for at least part of their journey before breaking apart. But crucially, no bodies were recovered. This discrepancy sparked renewed debate. Were the men casualties of Madeira breakup due to equipment failure? Or had they somehow survived initial incidents only to disappear elsewhere? The uncertainty mirrored the original radar readings, fragmented, contradictory, and impossible to reconcile with standard flight paths. One clue came from an intercepted German memo, dated February 21, 1944, found in post-war archives. Unidentified American bombers observed heading southeast, unable to intercept. Aircraft integrity intact. No survivors observed. Even decades later, historians puzzle over that line. If the aircraft were intact, what became of the 30 men aboard? Did they attempt emergency landings that went unrecorded? Were they lost due to navigational confusion, or perhaps a combination of faulty equipment and experimental interference? Some researchers argue that this mystery represents one of the earliest and most tragic consequences of electronic warfare in aviation history, a technology too advanced for its time, capable of endangering those it was meant to protect. Others suspect a deliberate operation, one quietly erased from records, leaving only faint blips on a radar screen and scattered metal in the woods. By the late 20th century, the legend of the missing B-17s had grown. Veteran pilots, mechanics, and historians alike would recount the story as a cautionary tale. The hazards of secrecy, the perils of untested technology, and the vulnerability of human life when experiments are conducted in the chaos of war. As the radar logs suggest, and as scattered wreckage confirms, the aircraft had ventured far beyond the map, into forests, hills, and valleys no one had intended them to reach. Their disappearance remained a riddle, hinting at both the brilliance and the danger of wartime innovation. In the next chapter, decades would pass before the first tangible pieces of the missing aircraft emerged, shifting the mystery from speculation to forensic reality, and revealing just how far off course the B-17s had traveled. It wasn't until 1999, more than 50 years after the disappearance, that a hiker in the Bavarian forest stumbled upon a small, rusted fragment of aluminum in a remote valley. Upon closer inspection, markings revealed a U.S. Army Air Force's serial number, unmistakably linked to one of the missing B-17s. The find sent shockwaves through the aviation history community, reigniting long-dormant questions about what had happened that fateful February day. Forensic teams from Germany and the United States arrived to survey the area. They documented scattered debris, oxygen tanks, wing panels, and fuselage fragments. Yet curiously, the largest sections of the aircraft were missing, and no human remains were discovered. The site lay more than 200 miles southeast of the 303rd Bomb Group's last confirmed position near Leipzig, reinforcing suspicions that the planes had deviated dramatically from their intended route. Historians pieced together the terrain and flight data. The debris patterns suggested a mid-air breakup or controlled crash, rather than a sudden flak explosion or fighter attack. Metallurgical analysis indicated battle damage consistent with anti-aircraft fire, but the structural integrity of the main fuselage remained largely intact. This contradicted standard crash physics. An aircraft losing significant flak damage in flight would typically produce a concentrated debris field, not fragments scattered over miles. Local witnesses offered fragments of their own stories. A retired forester recalled, "We saw planes flying very low through the valleys that day. Engines sounded normal. Then one disappeared behind the hills. Nothing, no crash, no smoke. We looked everywhere, found nothing." Adding another layer of intrigue, some researchers found subtle evidence of the experimental radio equipment previously installed on Lucky Lady and Eagle's Cry. Components of blind navigation beacons were discovered amid the debris, suggesting the aircraft were indeed carrying instruments associated with Operation Raven. If these devices had malfunctioned or reflected false signals, it could explain the drastic course deviation that had baffled radar operators in 1944. Yet the most baffling element remained the crew. None of the 30 men aboard were found. Standard protocols dictated emergency parachute deployment or recovery attempts, yet no traces of personal gear, dog tags, or remains were ever located. Some speculated that the airmen may have attempted emergency landings in heavily forested areas and succumbed to the elements, while others argued that a navigational error induced by experimental equipment could have led them far beyond the search radius. Forensic specialists and historians debated every theory. Had the plane simply disintegrated midair under unknown circumstances? Were the airmen victims of a failed experiment, deliberately classified and erased from operational records? Or could there have been an unrecorded, clandestine mission beyond the Leipzig target, one that involved a secret objective known only as Target Z? What became clear was that the B-17s had flown hundreds of miles off course, into terrain that no mission planner had accounted for. Yet the wreckage suggested controlled descent rather than catastrophic destruction, leaving a lingering sense of unanswered questions. Even today, researchers combing German archives and veteran testimonies encounter contradictory accounts, radar blips, eyewitness sightings, and scattered wreckage, but no definitive explanation for the missing crew. The Bavarian forest discovery transformed a long-standing rumor into tangible evidence, but it did little to solve the puzzle. It confirmed the plane's off-course path, corroborated fragments of German radar and eyewitness reports, and connected the story to the experimental electronic warfare program. But it also intensified the mystery. The crew's disappearance remained total, their fate sealed in silence and secrecy. As one historian wrote in a 2001 journal article, the missing B-17s are a reminder that technology and human courage do not always converge. Sometimes, even the most skilled crews can vanish into history without explanation. The mystery was no longer purely theoretical. It had become a forensic enigma. And yet, the final chapter of this story, the culmination of decades of speculation, records, and rediscovered debris, would only deepen the questions, as new evidence hinted at connections to classified Allied projects and unexplained wartime directives. Next, we explore the final chapter, the enduring legacy of the lost B-17s, Operation Raven, and why the truth may still lie hidden in the shadows of history. Decades after the disappearance, the story of the lost B-17s over Germany had become one of the most enduring mysteries of World War II aviation. Scholars, hobbyists, and military historians combed through every available record, wartime radar logs, German eyewitness accounts, and declassified U.S. Air Force files. But the fate of the 30 men remained unsolved. Yet in the shadows of this mystery, a pattern began to emerge, linking the disappearances to an obscure wartime initiative known as Operation Raven. Operation Raven was an experimental electronic warfare program initiated by the 8th Air Force in late 1943. Its purpose was deceptively simple: to test the use of navigational beacons capable of transmitting false signals, misleading enemy radar while simultaneously enhancing the accuracy of Allied bombing formations. What was not simple, and what remained classified, was the danger it posed to the crews who flew these early test flights. The missing B-17s had carried the latest Raven prototypes, untested under real combat conditions, their success or failure hidden under layers of secrecy. Declassified memos recovered in the 1980s and 1990s referenced unverified diversions and Target Z coordinates not associated with any known military objective. Some historians argue that the missing fortresses were deliberately flown into experimental corridors to test these new systems, their deviation from the planned route amplified by false signals bouncing across German terrain. The 3 planes that vanished in February 1944 may have been victims not of flak, fighters, or weather, but of technology itself still in its infancy. Physical evidence only deepened the mystery. Debris recovered in Saxony and Bavaria confirmed midair structural integrity, suggesting the planes had not been destroyed violently. Yet no human remains were found, despite exhaustive searches. Radar logs hinted at extended flight beyond expected fuel limits, as though the aircraft continued under autopilot or instrument guidance into remote valleys before disappearing entirely. Scholars now refer to these scenarios as phantom flights, missions that existed on paper and in radar echoes, but left no trace in the human record. The implications were sobering. Operation Raven had tested the boundaries of electronic warfare at the cost of human lives, lives never fully acknowledged in official reports. For the men of the 303rd Bomb Group, families, and fellow airmen, the absence of closure cast a long shadow. Memorials listed the missing alongside those confirmed killed in combat, but the ambiguity endured. Were these airmen casualties of war, victims of experimental technology, or part of a mission erased from history? Modern analysis provides lessons that extend beyond the history of World War II. It underscores the risks inherent in rapid technological innovation during wartime, particularly when secrecy overrides transparency and safety. It also reveals how operational ambiguity can create historical mysteries, leaving researchers, veterans, and families searching for answers decades later. In the end, the mystery of the lost B-17s is a cautionary tale and a testament to the bravery of those who flew them. 3 aircraft, 30 men, and a mission that ended in silence. Yet their story continues to captivate historians and aviation enthusiasts alike. The final record may never reveal exactly what happened over Saxony and Bavaria that cold February day in 1944. Yet the lost fortresses endure as a symbol of courage, the perils of early electronic warfare, and the unresolved secrets of one of the largest air forces ever assembled. Somewhere in the forests and valleys of Germany, pieces of Lucky Lady, Eagle's Cry, and Liberty Bell still lie scattered, silent witnesses to a mission that, to this day, remains an enigma. The sky that swallowed them has kept its secrets well. The truth of Target Z and Operation Raven may never be fully known, but the legacy of the missing B-17s lives on.